Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get again the opportunity to talk today about science and about the mystery of human consciousness based on recent scientific research on near-death experiences in survivors of cardiac arrest. A near-death experience, or an NDE, or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma, still gives rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. Because how can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories from a period of obvious unconsciousness? Or how is it possible that permanent life changes occur after cardiac arrest of only 2 minutes? As long as one not has experienced an NDE himself, it seems impossible to really understand the impact and the life-changing after effects of this overwhelming conscious experience. The existing worldview has radically changed. Quote, "You can be physically dead, but your mind lives on. Only one thing matters, your attitude toward other people. I accept life as it is, and I'm no longer afraid of death." I will not only talk about changes in consciousness during and after a near-death experience, but above all, I want to discuss my ideas about the possible relationship between consciousness and the brain. Important questions for me were, how is consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? And is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? And is there a biological basis of consciousness anyway? And is it possible to speak of a beginning of our consciousness? And will our consciousness ever end? I realize that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. I also realize that many aspects of consciousness are still a great mystery. Because, as the well-known philosopher David Chalmers has said, consciousness, the subjective experience of an inner self, poses one of the greatest challenges to science. Even a detailed knowledge of the brain's workings and neural correlates of consciousness may fail to explain how or why human beings have self-aware minds. The question is, how can scientific research on NDE help us to understand more about the mystery of consciousness and about the mystery of the mind-brain relation? And how started my interest in near-death experiences? In 1969, during my rotating internship, a patient was successfully resuscitated in the coronary care unit by electrical defibrillation. We mostly do not realize anymore that about 50 years ago, all patients with cardiac arrest died because modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and external chest compression were not yet available. But this patient regained consciousness after a period of unconsciousness of about 4 minutes. And we as a resuscitation team, it was all new for us, were of course very happy. But the patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. He told me about going through a tunnel, seeing a light and also beautiful colors and hearing music. I have never forgotten this event, but I did not do anything with it. And in that time, I did not know that in human history, the same experience have been told in many cultures, in many religions, and in all times, as shown in this painting from 1480 by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, showing deceased people escorted through a tunnel to the light. And only years later, In 1975, Raymond Moody first described the so-called near-death experiences. But only in 1986, I read about these experiences in the book by George Ritchie entitled Return from Tomorrow, which relates what he experienced during a period of 9 minutes duration in 1943 during his medical study. After reading this book, I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 survivors of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. So for me, it all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concepts, it is not possible to experience consciousness during a cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that it was obvious that consciousness was the product of a functioning brain. And up until that point, I always accepted it as indisputably true. But now the phenomenon of near-death experiences raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? And how does the content of an NDE come about? Why does a person's life change so radically after a near-death experience? I was unable to accept most of the answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. But first, what is a near-death experience? Some people who have survived a life-threatening crisis report an extraordinary conscious experience. An NDE can be defined as the reported memory of a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements, such as an out-of-body experience, present feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, a life review, or the conscious return into the body. And many circumstances are described during which NDEs are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, complicated childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also NDE-like experiences are reported in serious diseases, not immediately life-threatening, but also during depression, isolation, or meditation, or without any obvious reason. An NDE-like experience can also occur during the terminal phase of illness and are called deathbed visions or end-of-life experiences. So apparently, you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report an NDE. The NDE is transformational, always causing enhanced intuitive sensitivity, profound changes in life insight, and the loss of the fear of death. And this is why these kind of experiences are now called spiritual transformative experiences, or STE. And near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of the improved survival rates resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation and from better treatment from patients with cerebral trauma. The content of an NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide, across all cultures and all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual, cultural, and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and interpret the experience. Children and adults, Christians and atheists, Muslims and Buddhists, they all use different words from their own religion, culture, and tradition. And according to a recent at-random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 10 million people in the USA, about 2.5 million people in Italy, and more than 20 million people in Europe must have had a near-death experience. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about his NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. Patients must feel that you trust them, that you can listen without any comment or prejudice. But for most physicians, the NDE is still an incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. Once a conference was held in the University Hospital with more than 300 people in attendance, and at the end of the conference, after several lectures of about NDE, a man stood up and said, "I am a cardiologist for more than 25 years, and I have never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it." And then another man got up in the audience and said, "I am one of your patients. I have had an NDE during cardiac arrest, and you would be the last one I would ever tell." They know and feel that this kind of physician is not able to listen at all. Until recently, there was no prospective and scientifically designed study to explain the cause and content of an NDE. All studies were based on retrospective and very selective with respect to patients. And based on these incomplete retrospective studies, some believed the experience could be caused by physiological changes in the brain as a result of lack of oxygen, cerebral anoxia. Other theories encompass a psychological reaction to an approaching death, or hallucinations, or dreams, or side effects of drugs, or just false memories. So in 1988, we started a prospective study with 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause, and the content of an NDE. And this cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper, but our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, or demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. And so we did a short, standardized interview with sufficiently recovered patients within a few days of resuscitation and asked whether they could remember the period of unconsciousness and what they recalled. And we additionally performed a longitudinal study. Now, we studied patients who survived cardiac arrest because this is a well-described, life-threatening medical situation, which is also called clinical death. The definition of clinical death was used for the period of unconsciousness caused by lack of oxygen in the brain due to arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during cardiac arrest in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. And these patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model of the process of dying. Now, in case where memories were reported, we coded the experience according to a weighted core experience index. And in this system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. And the more elements were reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the score was. We found that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. However, 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection with of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 41 patients, 12%, had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher. And 6% had a superficial NDE. Now, which elements were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with an NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light or observed colors. About 30% of the patients had an observation of celestial landscape or had a meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a live review, and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE, but I know I've met patients who had a frightening NDE themselves, but not in our study. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? we found to our surprise that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, nor the need for intubation in complicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation, EPS, had any influence on the frequency of NDE. NS is not significant. So the degree or gravity of the lack of oxygen in the brain, anoxia, appeared to be totally irrelevant. So a physiological explanation for NDE, like anoxia, could be excluded. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, that you know that these experiences are possible. Gender, religion, atheist, Christian, didn't matter at all, or education. Now, we additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interviews, 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest, of all late survivors with an NDE, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. And the study was designed to assess whether the loss of the fear of death, the transformation and attitude toward life, and the enhanced intuitive sensitivity is the result of having an NDE, or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself, that had never been studied in a prospective design before. The NDE turned out to be a life-changing experience because only patients with an NDE did show this aforementioned typical transformation. In particular, they were less afraid of death and had a stronger belief in an afterlife. We saw in them a greater interest in spirituality and questions about the purpose of life, as well as a greater acceptance of and love for oneself in combination with a feeling of oneness with others and with nature. The conversations we had in our longitudinal study revealed that people, often to their own amazement and confusion, had acquired enhanced intuitive feelings after an NDE, or as many of them put it, they had acquired paranormal gifts. This enhanced intuition is based on interconnectedness with the consciousness of others and is independent of time, like the inner knowing of future events or having prognostic dreams. And it's independent of distance, the sense of knowing about an incoming phone call and of pain, illness, or upcoming death of people, which usually proves to be accurate. The sudden occurrence of this enhanced intuition can be quite problematic, as people suddenly have a very acute sense of others, which can be extremely intimidating. Sorry. As someone told me, I couldn't even talk about it, or I would have been committed to an institution. And I know people with an NDE who have been put in an institution because they kept on talking about it. Finally, it is a quite remarkable and surprising and unexpected finding to see a cardiac arrest lasting only a few minutes give rise to such a lifelong process of transformation. However, the integration and acceptance of an NDE is a process that may take many years because of the far-reaching impact on people's pre-NDE understanding of life and value system. Despite the mostly positive experience, the NDE is also a traumatic event because there is hardly any acceptance by doctors, nurses, family and partner, with a divorce rate of more than 70%. It's not the same person I was married before, which makes the process of acceptance and integration very difficult. And this process will take many, many years with strong feelings of depression, homesickness, and loneliness. But the longer the interval between NDE and interview, the more positive changes are usually reported. Now, in 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, still the only study with statistical analysis, 1 study from the USA and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 patients who survived cardiac arrest. And all authors conclude that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of the NDE. Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that the paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought processes during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation with brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. And Sempani and Peter Fenech from the British study write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness. And this is a surprising conclusion, because when the brain is so dysfunctional that the patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences such as are reported NDE should not arise nor be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience at all. Penny Sartori from the other British study concludes that according to mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when the brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. Now, with lack of evidence for any other theories for NDE, the concept, this far assumed but never scientifically proven, that consciousness and memories are produced by large groups of neurons and are localized in the brain, should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG? Scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. And NDE might be considered as a changing state of consciousness based on a theory of the continuity of consciousness, which memories, identity and cognition with emotion function independently from the unconscious body and retain the possibility of extrasensory perception. Obviously, during NDE, enhanced consciousness is experienced independently from the normal body-linked waking consciousness. Before I discuss in greater detail some neurophysiological aspects of normal brain function and during cardiac arrest, I would like to reconsider certain elements of the NDE, and first the out-of-body experience. In this experience, people have theoretical perceptions from a position outside and above their lifeless body. NDEs have the feeling that they have apparently taken off their body like an old coat. And to their surprise, they appear to have retained their own identity with the possibility of perceptions, emotions, and a very clear consciousness. This out-of-body experience is scientifically important because doctors, nurses, and relatives can verify the reported perceptions, and they can also corroborate the precise moment the NDE with OBE occurred during the period of CPR. In a review of more than 150 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body perception, it was found that more than 90% of the reported OBEs was completely accurate. Through verification, it was proven that all reported perceptions during coma, during CPR, cardiac arrest, or general anesthesia were about details that really had happened. Based on these theoretical aspects, an OBE can, by definition, not be an hallucination, nor an delusion, nor an illusion. Moreover, you need a functioning brain to have an hallucination, delusion, and the brain doesn't function during cardiac arrest. A real out-of-body experience is clearly shown in this drawing of a 6-year-old girl who nearly drowned and was resuscitated in the hospital. In this drawing, you see a happy, smiling girl looking from above to her own resuscitation, CPR. And she draws here external chest compression. A girl of 6 doesn't know anything about CPR, but she saw it. And this is the report of a coronary care nurse. During night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old cyanotic comatose man into the coronary care unit. He was found in coma about 30 minutes before in a meadow. When we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I removed his upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. Only after about an hour and a half, the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure, but he is still ventilated and intubated, and he is still comatose. He is transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the necessary artificial respiration for 1 week. And after more than a week in coma, do I meet again with the patient who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he says, "Oh yes, you know where my dentures are." I am very, very surprised. Then the patient elucidates, "Yes, you were there when I was brought into a hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them into that cart that had all these bottles on it, and there was this sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth." I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. It appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he perceived from above how nurses and doctors had been busy with the CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and into detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated, where he was admitted in coma and had left in coma, as well as the appearances of those present, like myself. Then the holographic live review. During this live review, the subject feels the presence and renewed experience of not only every act, but also of every thought from one's past life. And one realizes that all of it is an energy field which influences oneself as well as others. All that has been done and thought seems to be significant and stored. Because one is connected with the memories, emotions, and consciousness of another person, you experience the consequences of your own thoughts, words, and actions to that other person at the very moment in the past that they occurred. Interconnectedness. My patients survey their whole life in one glance. Time and space do not seem to exist during such an experience, non-locality. Quote, "All of my life up till the present seems to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic, three-dimensional review, and each event seemed to be accompanied by a consciousness of good or evil, with an insight into cause and effect. Not only did I perceive everything from my own viewpoint, but I also knew the thoughts of everyone involved in the event, as if I had their thoughts within me. This meant that I perceived not only what I had done and thought, but even in what way it had influenced others, as if I saw with all-seeing eyes. So even your thoughts are apparently not wiped out." Think about it for a moment. And all the time during the preview, the importance of love was emphasized. Looking back, I cannot say how long this live review and live insight lasted. It may have been long, for every subject came up, but at the same time it seemed just a fraction of a second, because I perceived it all at the same moment. Time and distance seemed not to exist. I was in all places at the same time, and sometimes an attention was drawn to something, and then I would be present there. It's also possible to come in contact with the consciousness of deceased persons, interconnectedness. Quote, "During my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship, my father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War. And my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before turned out to be my biological father. Some patients can describe how they returned into the body, mostly through the top of the head, after they had come to understand that it wasn't their time yet, or that they still had a task to fulfill. The conscious return into the body is experienced as something very oppressive. They regain consciousness in their body and realize that they are locked up again in their damaged body, meaning again all the pain and restriction of their disease. Quote, "When I came to in my body, it was dreadful, so dreadful. The experience had been so beautiful that I didn't want to come back. I wanted to stay there, and yet I came back. And from that moment, it was a real struggle to live my life inside my body with all the limitations I experienced at the time. But later I realized that this experience was in fact a blessing. For now I know that the mind and body are separate and that there's life after death." About all people who experience an NDE lose their fear of death. Quote, "It is outside my domain to discuss something that can only be proven by death. For me, however, this blessing experience was decisive in convincing me that consciousness lives on beyond the grave. And I know now for sure that body and mind are separated. Death was not death, but another form of life." Now, so we have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, all these reported elements of an NDE were experienced during a transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and of the brainstem with a flatline EEG. But how do we know that the EEG, the electrical activity of the cortex, is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest, and how can we measure this? Through many studies with induced cardiac arrest, both in human, like in threshold testing with ICDs, and in animal models, cerebral function has been shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing the clinical findings of the sudden loss of consciousness, the loss of breathing, apnoea, the loss of all body reflexes, which is a function of the cortex, and then also the loss of all brainstem reflexes like the gag reflex, the caudal reflex, and fixed and dilated pupils are clinical findings. And the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, but also in the deeper structures of the brain in animals, has been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. And in an acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest always succeeds, is always longer than 20 seconds. So all 562 survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies must have had a flatline EEG. Now let us come back to the mystery of human consciousness and to the mystery of the mind-brain relation. For me, it was indeed a scientific challenge to discuss new hypotheses that could explain the possibility to have a clear and enhanced consciousness during a transient period of a non-functioning brain, with memories, with self-identity, with cognition, with emotion, with the possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body, and to explain the reported interconnectedness with the consciousness of other persons in the past and of deceased relatives, and to explain the possibility of experience instantaneously and simultaneously non-locality, a review and a preview of someone's life in a dimension without a conventional body-linked concept of time and space, where all past, present, and future events exist, and even to explain the experience of the conscious return into the body. I would like to quote Robert Oppenheimer, the famous American theoretical physicist, who has said, "There's no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any questions, to doubt any assertion, to seek for evidence, to correct any errors. But most materialist scientists still don't believe in the possibility to experience and enhance consciousness during a period of a non-functioning brain. And they try to debunk everything I have said and written by simply stating that it is obvious that an NDE must be produced by the brain. They only change their mind as soon as they have experienced an NDE themselves, like Eben Alexander and many other physicians. So my advice to these debunkers is, try this small and dangerous footpath and find out yourself. In my book, Endless Consciousness, was published in 2007 in the Netherlands and was translated into the English language as Consciousness Beyond Life. It was a worldwide bestseller with more than 250,000 copies sold. And it has been translated into 8 languages, also into the Italian language as Coscienza oltre la vita. In my book, I have written that based on prospective studies on NDE, based on recent findings in neurophysiological research, and based on concepts from quantum physics, our consciousness cannot be localized in a certain time nor space. And this is called non-local consciousness, beyond time and space, because almost all the reported aspects of consciousness during cardiac arrest seem to be quantum-like phenomena, like non-local interconnectedness or entanglement, and like a higher dimensional non-local realm consisting of wave fields of probability, where every past and future event exists and is available as a possibility. Within this so-called non-local realm, no matter is present. Everything belongs to uncertainty, and neither measurements nor observations are possible by physicists because the act of observation instantly changes a probability into actuality by collapse of the wave function. Roger Penrose called this resolution of multiple possibilities into one definite state objective reduction. So it seems that no observation is possible without fundamentally changing the observed object. Only subjectivity remains. And this is neither the place nor the time to go into quantum mechanics into more detail. We heard a lot about this today by Judy. But we should conclude, like many others, that quantum mechanical processes could have something critical to do with how aspects of consciousness relate with our brain and our body. However, quantum field theory cannot explain the essence of consciousness, nor the secret of life, but it is helpful for understanding my concept of non-local consciousness. Quantum physics should be regarded as an analogy to understand some aspects of NDE. So, and in this concept of endless, of non-local consciousness, with declarative memories, finds its origin in, and is stored in this non-local realm of wave fields of information. And the brain only serves as a relay station for parts of these wave fields of consciousness to be received into or as our waking consciousness. The function of the brain should so be compared with a transceiver, a transmitter, receiver, or interface, exactly like the function of a computer. Different neuronal networks function as interface for different aspects of our consciousness. And the function of neuronal networks should be regarded as receivers and conveyors, not as retainers of consciousness and memories. And in this concept, non-local consciousness is not rooted in the measurable domain of physics, our manifest world. However, the physical aspects of consciousness, which originate from the wave aspects of our consciousness through collapse of the wave function, objective reduction, can be measured by means of neuroimaging techniques like EEG, fMRI, and PET scan. With this concept of non-local consciousness, all reported elements of an NDE during cardiac arrest could be explained. Now, in trying to understand this concept of interaction between non-local consciousness and the material body, it seems appropriate to compare it with modern worldwide communication. There is a continuous exchange of objective information by means of electromagnetic fields for radio, television, mobile telephone, or laptop computer. At this very moment, we're invaded by hundreds of thousands of telephone calls, and hundreds of radio and television programs, but we become only aware of these electromagnetic informative fields at the moment we use our mobile telephone or by switching on our radio, TV, or laptop. What we receive is neither inside the instrument nor in the components, but thanks to the receiver, the information from the electromagnetic fields, the cloud, becomes observable to our senses, and hence perception occurs in our consciousness. Internet with more than 1 billion websites can be received at about the same moment in the USA, in Europe, and in Australia, but is obviously not located inside our laptop, nor is it produced by it. Information from internet is always and everywhere available because it is stored in the cloud. And this concept of the cloud can be compared with non-local consciousness. Since the publication of several prospective studies on NDE in survivors of cardiac arrest with strikingly similar results and conclusions, the phenomenon of NDE can no longer be scientifically ignored. It is an authentic experience, conscious experience, which cannot be simply reduced to imagination, fear of death, hallucination, psychosis, the use of drugs, or oxygen deficiency. And people appear to be permanently changed by an NDE during a cardiac arrest of only some minutes' duration. According to these studies, the current materialistic view of a relationship between the brain and the consciousness held by most physicians, philosophers, and psychologists is too restricted for a proper understanding of this phenomenon. Materialistic science starts principally from a reality that is only based on physically observable data. But we should be aware that beside external and so-called objective perception and observation, there are also subjective, not observable and not demonstrable aspects like thoughts, feelings, inspiration, and intuition. We can only measure the electrical, magnetic, chemical activities in the brain by EEG, MEG, and PET scan, and we can measure changes in blood flow in the brain by fMRI. But these are only neural correlates of consciousness. These measurements do not explain anything about the production nor about the content of consciousness, as we heard today as well. With our currently available scientific and objective techniques, one is not able to even prove, measure, objectify, nor falsify the content of the subjective experience in our consciousness. Direct proof about how neurons or neuronal networks could possibly produce the subjective essence of our thoughts and feelings is totally missing. By making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local and so ubiquitous phenomenon, the view can contribute to new ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain, and we should also question a purely materialist paradigm in science. So it seems to be important for our scientific ideas about the mind-brain and mind-body relationship. It's also evident that it's important for our concepts of life and death, because of the almost unavoidable conclusion that at the time of physical death, consciousness will continue to be experienced in another dimension in which all past, present, and future is enclosed. However, we should acknowledge that research in NDE cannot give us irrefutable scientific proof for this conclusion, because people with NDE did not quite die, but they all were very close to death and without a functioning brain. So it has indeed been scientifically proven that during NDE, enhanced consciousness was experienced independently of a functioning brain. So death is only the end of our physical aspects. So we have a body and we are conscious. Recently someone with an NDE wrote to me, "I can live without my body, but apparently my body cannot live without me." I believe now that death, like birth, may be a mere passing from one state of consciousness into another. So based on scientific research in NDE, I cannot avoid the conclusion that endless consciousness has been and always will exist independently from the body. There's no beginning, nor will there ever be an end to our consciousness. Our enhanced consciousness resides not in our brain and is not limited to our brain, because our consciousness is non-local and our brain has a facilitating function and not a producing function to experience consciousness. The NDE seems to be a personal rediscovery of wisdom and insight that is ages and ages old and has been well known in many cultures and in all times, but nowadays seems to be forgotten. I would like to quote Plato, who wrote more than 2,000 years ago, "The temporary material body is the temporary carrier of our immortal soul. Time does not exist in the immaterial world." And the famous French philosopher Henri Bergson has said, "The more we become accustomed to this idea of a consciousness which overflows the organ we call the brain, then the more natural and probably we find the hypothesis that the soul survives the body." And I sincerely hope that quantum physicist Max Planck was wrong when he said in 1934, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." And I'm very positive because I see and meet more and more young people are open to this change in science. Over more than a century ago, psychologists William James and Frederick Myers already studied extraordinary experiences in our human consciousness. Both called into question the still dominant view that consciousness is a product of the brain. Myers and James made a major contribution to the study and description of special states of consciousness, such as mystical or religious experiences, unconscious aspects of man, what they called subliminal consciousness, hypnosis, trance, premonitions, and physical changes caused by suggestion, like we know now as placebo effect. William James wrote about religious or mystical states of consciousness and concluded, "To plead a physiological causation of a religious state of mind is quite illogical and arbitrary unless one has already worked out in advance some psychophysical theory connecting spiritual values in general with specific physiological changes in the brain." And even in 1898, James wrote that the brain's role in experience of consciousness is not a productive, but a permissive or transmissive role. That is, it admits or transmits information. He wrote, "Our normal waking consciousness, our rational consciousness, as we call it, is but one special state of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different." So in his view, consciousness does not originate in this physical world, but already exists in another transcendental sphere. Access to aspects of consciousness depends on the personal threshold of consciousness, which for some people is lower than for others, which allows them to experience various aspects of enhanced consciousness. And for people in NDE, the threshold of consciousness is permanently changed as well. Frederick Myers wrote, "If consciousness be a mere epiphenomenon, we shall of course expect that consciousness is exclusively linked with the functional disintegration of central nervous elements and varies in its intensity with the rapidity or energy of that disintegration. An ordinary experience, at least within physiological limits, will support some view like this. Yet now and then we find a case where vivid consciousness has existed during a state of apparent coma." It was more than 100 years ago that he wrote it. "Until this new field has been more fully worked out, we have no right to make any absolute assertion as to the concomitant cerebral processes in which consciousness depends. How up to date is this conclusion?" And William James draws on experiences of altered states of consciousness to support his theory of transmissive function of the brain. The total expression of human experience, as I view it objectively, invincibly urged me beyond the current narrow scientific bounds. He speaks of the continuity of consciousness, and both his approach and his terminology are remarkably similar to my concept of non-local consciousness. In a posthumously published book, Myers even wrote about the human personality surviving physical death, while James too was convinced that man's consciousness lends him an aspect of immortality. For obvious reasons, there was also 1 century ago a lot of criticism about the conclusions. So William James once should have added, first, you know, a new theory is attacked as absurd, then it is admitted to be true, but obviously and insignificant. And finally, it is seen to be so important that its adversaries claim that they have themselves discovered it. And I hope that will happen soon nowadays. Now, today, many more cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, and philosophers come to the inevitable conclusion that it is extremely unlikely that consciousness could be a product of brain function, which confirms what Australian neurophysiologist, philosopher, and Nobel Prize winner Sir John Eccles has once stated. The brain is the messenger to consciousness. Interestingly, the English physicist, astronomer, and mathematician Sir James Jeans wrote many years ago, I incline to the idealistic theory that consciousness is fundamental, that the material universe is derivative from consciousness, not consciousness from the material universe. And even in 1931, the famous theoretical physicist, Nobel Prize winner and originator from quantum theory, Max Planck, has said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything what we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And this is again recently confirmed by Donald Hoffman, the American cognitive scientist from UC Irvine, who has written, consciousness realism is a non-physicalist monism. What exists in the objective world, independent of my perception, is a world of conscious agents, not a world of unconscious particles and fields. Consciousness is ontologically fundamental. Consciousness is first. Matter and fields depend on it for their very existence. Matter is derivative and among the symbols constructed by conscious agents. So we need a new post-materialist approach in science to accept these new concepts about consciousness. But unfortunately, new ideas are usually ridiculed or neglected. As the physician Ian Stevenson, who published a lot about reincarnation, once stated, it has been said that there is nothing so troublesome as a new idea, and I think that is particularly true in science. We desperately need a real paradigm shift in science. I believe and hope that in the near future, modern science will include empirical research on unusual subjective experiences that may occur in our current consciousness, that we will accept non-local concepts to understand how we are interconnected with each other and with our endangered planet. Now, obviously, more knowledge about the results of NDE research and about the possible continuity of human consciousness after death could have a significant impact on the practice of medicine, because it informs ideas about the treatment of patients in coma or in the final stages of terminal illness. It could also obviously result in difference in medical practice regarding procedures such as initiating or ending life-prolonging treatment, euthanasia, or the removal of organs for transplantation for somebody in a dying process with a beating heart and a warm body with a diagnosis of brain death. But NDE research is not only of great practical significance for healthcare practitioners, but also for dying patients and their families. They all ought to be aware of the extraordinary conscious experience that may occur during a period of clinical death or coma, an NDE, around the deathbed and the dying, end-of-life experiences, or even after death communication. So experiences of enhanced consciousness may also occur during the terminal phase of illness, when patients sometimes report encounters with deceased loved ones who welcome them, the sight of a beautiful unearthly environment and a bright light, or the sense of unconditional love. The content of such deathbed visions can bear a striking resemblance to an NDE. And like the NDE, such an end-of-life experience takes away the fear of death. Unfortunately, many accounts of deathbed visions are either not recognized as such or are interpreted as hallucination, terminal confusion, or as the side effects of medication. And the so-called after-death communication, or ADC, is the inner feeling of inner knowing to be in contact with the consciousness of a deceased person. This contact can be consisting of a sensing a presence, feeling touched, seeing the deceased person, or is sometimes accompanied by communication, certain fragrances, or unexpected chance incidents that are intuitively linked with the dead person. These experiences mostly occur during sleep, and this is why they usually call it just a dream. The result of an ADC is usually that the fear for their own death will disappear as well. People share their experiences only when they feel a great deal of trust and know that they will not be at the receiving end of prejudice or negative comments, like it's just wishful thinking or it's just your grief talking. In our Western society, it's still a taboo to talk about the sensation of being in contact with deceased loved ones during the weeks, months, or years after his or her death, despite the fact that about 125 million people in Europe and about 100 million people in the USA must have had an after-death communication. It's so familiar. The fact that contact is possible with the consciousness of a deceased relative is usually very comforting and helpful in a period of mourning. And healthcare workers or family members should not call an ADC an hallucination. And we should listen to them without prejudice and without negative comments. And to provide NDEs and other people with an experience of enhanced consciousness with better help and support than they currently receive, all healthcare workers and family members ought to consider the possibility of an NDE of our patients suffer a life-threatening crisis like cardiac arrest or coma, or to consider a deathbed vision during the terminal phase of illness, and to consider an ADC after someone lost a dear loved one. In the event of an NDE or similar experience, the doctor or therapist should not reject the experience as pathological or anomalous incident, but regard it as an existential and life-changing spiritual crisis with all the disorientation and physiological problems such a crisis entails. So in the past, a lot has been written about life and death, and also about special states of enhanced or non-local consciousness. But surprisingly, many people nowadays still has never heard about NDEs, as this is why they still believe that death is the end of our existence and the end of our consciousness. People are afraid that with death everything comes to an end. And as a young doctor, that was also my idea about death. I was raised in an academic world where I was taught that for every observation, a reductionist and materialist so-called scientific explanation was obvious, which made it impossible to accept that the clear consciousness could be experienced during a period of cardiac arrest or coma, or even briefly before, during, or after death. But today, science, for me, means asking questions with an open mind. Science should be the search for explaining new mysteries, especially about the mystery of human consciousness and about the mystery of the mind-brain relation, rather than to stick with materialist concepts. And he who has never changed his mind because he could not accept new concepts has rarely learned something. I can assure you that I learned quite a lot because of all those patients who were willing to share their NDE with me. as they have greatly changed my views on the meaning of life and death. People with NDE have been my greatest teachers. My current view is now that, as I've already stated before, there are good reasons to assume that our consciousness does not always coincide with the functioning of our brain, and hence consciousness can sometimes be experienced separately from the body. And I'm aware that this concept can be little more than a stimulus for further study and debate. And above all, we should question the pure and materialist paradigm in science. Remarkably, in a recent representative social poll in Europe, about 55% of the population, more than 250 million people, believed in some kind of personal survival. And in the USA, this percentage was even higher. These surprising high figures are in sharp contrast with the opinion of the majority of Western scientists who systematically ignore and ridicule the possibility of personal survival after physical death. Now, I realize now that consciousness is fundamental, that everything originates from consciousness. And I also understand that people create their own subjective reality based on their consciousness and create the intention one lives his life. We should recognize that our view of the world is wrong because we do not realize that the world as we see it only derives its subjective reality from our consciousness, because it is only our consciousness that is determining how we perceive this world. If we are in love, the world around us is beautiful. When we're depressed, our world is like hell. When we are frightened, made terrified by the politicians and by the press, our world will be full of terror. The mind in its own place and in itself can make a heaven or hell, wrote John Milton even in 1667 in his poem, Paradigm Lost. So regarding what we can learn from people who are willing to share their NDE with us, or after-death communication with us, I would like to quote Dag Hammarskjöld. Our ideas about death define how we live our life. Because as long as we believe that death is the end of everything we are, we will give our energy toward the temporary and material aspects of our life. In our short-sightedness and sometimes willful ignorance, we forget to reflect on the future of our planet, where our children and grandchildren will have to live and survive. We forget about the sustainability as we are now destroying and exhausting systematically our planet, just because we are living in a competitive and materialistic society. We should stop thinking and acting as we are better than others, because this will always be at the expense of children and other weak and delicate creatures around the world. We should realize that the harm we cause to each other and to nature ultimately is harming ourselves, because we as humans are not only intensively interconnected, entangled with each other, but also with animals and plants living on our endangered earth. I hope that in the near future we will accept non-local concepts to understand how we are and always will be interconnected with each other, also after physical death. That we have to change our personal consciousness, not only to change the way we live, but also to change the way we want to treat, honor, and respect people who are willing and able to share the NDE or ADC with us. Their lives changed in ways they were not prepared for. And they all tell us that they fundamentally changed their ideas about life and death, because, quote, you can be physically dead, but your mind lives on. And another quote, death was not death, but another form of life. Consciousness seems to be our essence. And once we leave our body, leave our physical world, we exist as pure consciousness, beyond time and space. We are enfolded in pure, unconditional love. Obviously, this new insight helps us to better understand the mystery of human consciousness. As a woman with NDE wrote to me, when the power of love becomes stronger than our love for power, our world will change. It will require a huge change in consciousness indeed. We should all feel the responsibility for this change. Thank you.